Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Project Warlock for PC. This is a first-person shooter developed by Buckshot Software and published by Gaming Company in October of this year, and it's gone on to be generally fairly well received, although there are some hits or misses here and there. And currently it's only available through GOG, but eventually it will be coming to other platforms as well. The game is meant to be a bit of a hybrid between old school design principles and some new mechanics that they thought would be a good idea to put in there, like say a leveling system, weapon upgrades, perks, that sort of thing. And the store page claims that it's meant to appeal to both classic first-person shooter aficionados as well as people who are fans of more modern indie games. So let's go ahead and actually start delving into this thing and find out whether it lives up to those claims. Well, as far as the presentation is concerned, it is definitely styled to look like an old-school first-person shooter with its pixel art aesthetic, even though it does use fully 3D environments. Although the way the level's ceilings are designed, it feels a lot more like, say, Wolfenstein 3D or Blakestone or something along those lines than it does the likes of, say, Doom or Heretic or Hexen. Because I'm sure you've noticed by now, but the vast majority of the environments in this game have absolutely no verticality to them at all, or if they do have verticality, it's in extremely limited circumstances. And those circumstances basically amount to you go into an elevator, it lifts you to a different part of the level, you go around on the horizontal plane of that particular area, and then you might find another elevator somewhere else that either takes you back to the floor you were already on, or it takes you even further somewhere else, and you continue to repeat this process until you get to the end of the level. And even though there is plenty of variety in the way the environments actually look in terms of their set dressing, this lack of verticality and this lack of things like stairs or somehow inclined planes makes it seem like the environments are rather lazily designed, or at the very least are amateurish in their design. Because sure, they're labyrinthine in their design in an attempt to emulate the old school first-person shooter level design, and they have secret areas, and you might have to solve a switch puzzle or two to get to a new area. You might wander into an area and then a door will open behind you or something along those lines, and enemies will pour out of it. All of these generally fairly old school design principles. But at the same time, if you were to look at an aerial view of all of the maps, it's a bunch of boxes and corridors with absolutely no additional polygons whatsoever. Purely squares and rectangles. And that tends to wear on you after a while. Luckily they did work some variety into the levels in terms of the way they look, because you've got 5 different zones, so to speak. Starting with medieval, moving on to Antarctica, which is basically a reference to John Carpenter's The Thing, and then you move on to ancient Egypt, and then to a future cityscape, and finally to hell. And each of these environments does of course come with its own unique look, but it also comes with a selection of unique enemies to fight, so even if the actual level design gets extremely bland extremely quickly, at least the visuals don't really wear out their welcome, unless of course you count the engine problem that the game has right now, which is that it is way too friggin' dark. And at first I thought it was just a deliberate design choice, and I've seen other people complain about it too, but later I did find out that it's a known issue with the game code right now, and the developer is looking at fixing it with the next patch, although I don't really know when that's going to be, and it hasn't dropped yet as of making this video, so your mileage may vary on whether the game is way too friggin' dark or not. For now, the workaround is to simply run the game on the medium visual settings as opposed to the high visual settings, and for whatever reason that fixes the lighting issue, although certainly at the cost of visual quality. And speaking of visual quality, the pixel art itself is definitely very retro styled, and it does work out in the game's favor somewhat, although the fatigue from pixel art indie games is definitely real, and the generally fairly dark and bland color scheme doesn't really do the pixel art all that many favors, so even though it is detailed, it's kinda hard to get excited about it. Still, they did at least understand that a lot of particle effects and a lot of blood and gore and jibbing effects are definitely beneficial to an old school styled first-person shooter, so they throw those in here in spades, and that does help the game out a fair bit, at least in terms of combat feel. But the visuals themselves, while certainly rather high quality for an indie game, are just not all that impressive. But then you move over to sound design and things get a lot more consistent. Generally speaking, the sound effects in this are fairly beefy and concussive, although the sound effect that the chain gun makes is really just kind of migraine-inducing. Everything else sounds pretty good though, and you've got a rather solid soundtrack that's a mixture of electronic and rock, and it generally works very well for the game. And while there is supposed to be voice acting in the sense of the player character saying some things every so often, I don't seem to have encountered that at all in the game. I'm not sure if it's something that was only in the trailers, or if it's a glitch, or if it's intentionally designed that way, but he just occasionally grunts and groans and maybe cusses at some point when he takes damage, and that's pretty much it. So that's a bit disappointing, but otherwise the rest of the sound design's pretty solid, and the presentation in general, while certainly having its ups and downs, mostly tends towards the positive rather than the negative. But regardless of how the presentation is, what really matter are the story, or in this case rather lack thereof, and the gameplay. And I say lack thereof in terms of story because I don't really think there is one. All I know is that you play as some guy who happens to be able to cast spells and also fight things, and he goes through all of these environments, slaughtering every single thing in his path, until eventually he fights the devil itself. I don't know if the game was supposed to give me some sort of cutscene or some sort of title screen telling me what the story is, or if I just skipped over all of that by accident, or whatever the case may be. But regardless of whatever the story is, the game is obviously all about the gameplay, because the entire interaction you have with this thing is going from level to level, slaughtering everything in your path, and eventually getting to the next level by going to the demon door and shooting through it, and then moving on to the portal or the next area or whatever the case may be. So let's go ahead and talk about the gameplay. What do you actually have on display here? Well, like I said, this is a first-person shooter, and it is styled after old-school first-person shooters, which means that you have a wide selection of weapons available to you that you can just eviscerate your opponents with. And aside from absolutely annihilating your opponents, you try to navigate the labyrinthine levels, occasionally finding some keys that will open doors that will allow you to access new areas of the level, and you might occasionally have to solve a switch puzzle or two, nothing particularly serious, in order to progress to the next area. The game is broken up into 5 episodes, like I already mentioned. You start in medieval, then you move to Antarctica, then you move to ancient Egypt, and then you move to the futuristic industrial zone, and finally you go to Hell. And every single one of these episodes has a sequence of levels until you get to the final level, where you have a boss fight before moving on to the next episode. As is fitting for the old school first-person shooter design principles that it draws so heavily from, there is no regenerating health here. Instead, you have to find health pickups scattered around the levels, and you might also find some secret areas here and there, which will give you access to treasure, which in this case is not actually used for points, but is rather used for experience points that will then cause you to level up, but I'll get to that in a moment. And you'll also find additional ammo pickups, additional weapon pickups, including some weapons that you might access earlier than if you were to just go through the levels normally. And as far as all that stuff is concerned, they generally do a pretty good job with it. Most of the weapons feel nice and punchy, although some of them take some upgrades before they start to feel that way, something I'll get to in a moment. And they've done a good job of making sure that the secret areas are sufficiently hidden that you won't notice them if you're not specifically looking for secret areas, but if you're an old school first-person shooter fan, then you'll be able to pick up on the signs relatively easily. And they did certainly put in enough health and ammo pickups to where as long as you're not playing like a complete moron and getting yourself annihilated every 5 seconds, you shouldn't run into too many difficulties with not having enough health or ammo. There is, however, one particular mechanic they decided to put in the game that was in very old school first-person shooters but was very quickly removed for good reason, and that is a life system. The way it works is that if you run out of health and you end up dying, you start at the beginning of that level instead of starting over at the beginning of that entire section, which can be several levels long. Usually they're somewhere between 3 and 4 levels long, and if you run out of lives, then you start at the beginning of that section instead. So even if you do manage to run out of lives, then it's not that much progress you're losing, but it is still very annoying, especially considering that there's one particular old school principle they forgot to include, which is a save anywhere feature, and I suspect that they thought the life system would replace it. Now, The Save Anywhere feature is a staple of old school first-person shooters. You either hit the quick save key and you just immediately save your game, or you go to the main menu, you pick a save slot, and you type out your save name and all that sort of thing, and then you are either free to quit the game, or if you want to try something reckless, you can go try it. But in Project Warlock, you can't do that because it doesn't operate with a save system really of any kind. There are only 3 instances in which the game will save. It will save at the beginning of a section when you go into the teleporter to get to that section. It will save at the end of a section when you go back to the workshop, and it will save within a section when you complete a particular level and move on to the next level. The only real saving grace of that is that generally speaking the levels are between 5 and 10 minutes long, so it's not like you're losing a ton of progress if you have to quit in the middle of a section, but it is still definitely very annoying, and it's kind of baffling as to why they didn't at least include a save and quit feature. Regardless, the lack of any sort of manual save feature is very conspicuous by its absence, and you may think that the life system would be a particularly nasty problem for the game, and particularly when you get to the later stages of the game when it gets more difficult, but that's not really as much of a problem as you might expect, and that's something I'll get to in a moment, because I have to now talk about the features that they put into the game that are not old school. Specifically, they put in a leveling feature, a spellcasting mechanic, and an upgrade feature. So, the spellcasting mechanic is basically your offhand. You have a spell slot where you can just swap between different spells that you unlock throughout the course of the game, and these can be things like just casting a light spell, which is the one I used for the vast majority of the game, or using something that shoots out a blast of cold that freezes enemies within its path, and then you can just shoot them to shatter them all over the place. And that ends up being pretty handy, but the rest of the spells I just didn't really end up using because they use the same upgrade points that your weapons do. And I generally found that the weapons were both much more satisfying to use than the spells were, and generally speaking, devastatingly effective once they're upgraded. So the way the upgrade system works is that you have upgrade points that you'll find throughout the levels, and of course you'll get a ton of them when you defeat a boss, and you can go into the workshop between the episodes and between the sections of those episodes in order to upgrade your stats and your spells and your weapons. So in the case of weapon upgrades, you take your upgrade points, you go to the weapon upgrade station, and there are 2 choices for every single weapon. So to give you an example, you can switch between either a rapid fire pistol, or you can change it into a rather large magnum that will do a ton of damage but consume a lot of ammo per shot. You can upgrade the laser rifle into a rapid fire laser rifle or a railgun. You can upgrade the chain gun into either a turret form or a heavy bolter that doesn't have any sort of spin-up time. You can upgrade the double-barreled shotgun into a quad-barrel shotgun, or a double-barreled shotgun still, but it shoots incendiary rounds and you can shoot them out of each barrel individually before reloading. And those are only a few of the choices you get for the various weapon upgrades. There's 2 weapon upgrades for every single weapon you pick up in the game, and even though the upgrades are permanent throughout the course of that playthrough, there's always the idea of going through the game again and picking the other weapon choice and seeing how that works out for you. The thing is, you also have to keep in mind these upgrade points are also used for purchasing spells, and it's basically a one or the other kind of situation. Either you can spend them on weapon upgrades, or you can spend them on spells. You're not going to have enough upgrade points throughout the entire game to get every single upgrade in every single spell. I suppose you could say that's an idea that's meant to increase replay value, but it's a bit more annoying than anything else, because it means that you basically either have to go an all-weapons build or an all-spell build or something along those lines. And the game is very clearly weighted in favor of the weapons rather than the spells, because you only get 1 spell slot, and the way you switch between spells is pretty wonky. You have to hold the use key and scroll the mouse wheel to do it. Not to mention you'll have to spend a fair few stat points into upgrading your spirit so you can actually have a lot more mana. You see, there's also the leveling system that I mentioned, where you'll get stat points on every level up, and every 5 levels you get an additional perk point that you can spend on buying different perks if you actually have the requirements for them unlocked anyway. And these are meant to give you small but noticeable improvements in your capabilities over time. The thing is, there's only 2 stats that are truly worth increasing a large degree, and those are life and capacity. And they're exactly what you think. Increasing life increases the number of hit points you have, and increasing capacity increases the amount of ammunition you can carry. The other 2 stats are strength, which only increases the amount of damage you do with melee attacks, and spirit, which increases the amount of mana you have. And I guess if you're using spells a lot, that can be helpful, but I found that investing all my points into life and capacity was really the way to go, because the spells don't use all that much mana, and you can certainly get a lot of mana pickups throughout the levels, so it's not really that big of a deal. And as far as melee goes, how often are you going to be using melee when you have a wide variety of weapons available to you, most of which do quite a lot of damage? The only reason you'd end up using the melee later on is because you have the upgrade for the melee weapon, which is an axe, that allows you to either siphon health from enemies or siphon mana from enemies when you hit them. Other than that, there's not really much reason to use the axe, because you do have another melee weapon that doubles as a ranged weapon, and that's a dagger that you can throw at things that returns to your hand, costs no mana or ammunition to use, and does quite a bit of damage actually when you throw it. The only major downside is that it has a rather slow rate of fire, but you can kind of work around that. So that makes the strength stat relatively useless, although you might want to invest a couple of points into it, at least to unlock some of the perks that are available with it. Because every 5 levels you get a perk point, which you can then invest into various perks that will also give you tangible bonuses, like for example increasing your running speed, or increasing the amount of ammo that you get when you pick up ammo, or things along those lines. Much like with the stats, they're fairly slight changes, but over time when you get the combination of the stats and the perks, it does add up. The problem is that if anything, it adds up too much, because at least on the standard difficulty, the game is way too frickin' easy. I found that the game became effectively trivial once I unlocked the incendiary rounds upgrade for the double-barreled shotgun, because one shot is enough to annihilate most of the enemies. It's pretty ridiculous. I mean, sure, it makes you feel like a badass the first few times you annihilate things with a single shot and they just crumple into smoldering masses, but after a while, it just starts to become boring, because you're just annihilating pretty much everything with a single shot, and the problem is that it does that with most of the weapons. If you upgrade the pistol to the Magnum, for example, you can take out all of the basic grunt enemies with a single shot, and the slightly more powerful enemies only take about 2 or 3 shots to bring down. And because the enemy AI is rather dumb, and their strategy consists of charge at you, and if they have a ranged attack, they throw a ranged attack at you while they're charging at you, until eventually you end up falling over, which, in my case, never happened. I only died twice in the entire game. The first of them was that I got stuck on the environment when I was fighting the first boss, and it ended up annihilating me with like 2 or 3 hits. And then the next time I went up against it, I barely lost any health at all. And then the second one was that I accidentally fell into a pit of lava on the hell level. And that was it. You may think, but DW, obviously that's only because you're fighting the grunt enemies. When you get to the boss fights, that's gotta be more difficult, right? Well, it's definitely a spoiler, but I'm gonna just show you a clip of when I fought the 4th episode boss. So just have a basic idea. This is the last boss you fight before you go to hell. It should be one of the toughest bosses in the game, so just observe, and then after that you'll have a pretty good idea of how the boss fights are in the game, because every single one of them is almost exactly the same as that. Yeah, in case you couldn't tell from that clip alone, the bosses are complete pushover in this game. Again, it's just way too easy. It takes effectively no effort to actually play this thing if you have even a passive familiarity with first-person shooters. About the only thing that actually poses a threat to you is the environment, because occasionally you can get kind of stuck on the environment, at which point the enemy can wail on you for a while if they either get close enough, or if you don't move out of that spot before the enemy's projectiles hit you, although their projectiles are fairly slow, so they're fairly easy to avoid, even with the relatively slow movement speed in this. Even once I unlocked the perk that increases your movement speed by 20%, I actually didn't notice an increase in speed, so either it's such a slight increase that I didn't notice it, or it doesn't actually do anything, in which case it's probably glitched. Regardless, I didn't increase the movement speed because I needed it to dodge projectiles or anything. I was not having any trouble with that anyway. I increased it because you move slowly enough that the game just kind of becomes dull. It's particularly problematic when you get to certain levels that require some backtracking, because even though the majority of levels have the designs fold in around themselves enough to where you don't really have to do a lot of backtracking, there are a few that do require a fair bit of it, and that can be pretty frustrating to deal with if you're going through an empty level, just slowly plodding along until eventually you find that one switch you missed somewhere. And by the time you get to the end of the game, it's not so much a matter of, hell yeah, I beat the game, it's more a matter of, well, at least it's finally over. And that's never a feeling you should really have when playing a first-person shooter. And it's not because the game is bad or anything, it's actually not an outright bad game, it's just flawed enough to where it's really not good either. It's an instance of, oddly enough, making the weapons too powerful. See, you gotta strike a very delicate balance between the weapons feeling really powerful, but the enemies also being tough enough to take the punishment. In this particular instance, they made the weapons feel definitely powerful, but they're so powerful that the enemies can't stand up against them. Maybe that's something that's remedied somewhat in the hard mode by increasing the amount of health that enemies have, but that doesn't change the fact that the casual difficulty is hilariously easy, the standard difficulty is really more pathetically easy, and then if you switch it over to hard mode, it doesn't really become much more difficult as much as it becomes more annoying, because then you just have to worry about not losing the one life you have, because if you do, your progress resets. Which is a pretty lazy way of trying to make the game artificially difficult. And when you bring everything together, you find that the game doesn't really satisfy the groups it says it's going to appeal to. Because for old school first-person shooter fans, sure, there's a fair bit on offer there, and some of that is actually quite good, but it's just a bit too modern in the sense that it's got too many roguelike elements in it. And of course, it's way too easy on the standard difficulty, and the hard mode just turns it into a roguelike. Whereas for the indie fans, sure, it'll be more appealing to them, but at the same time, it's probably a bit too old school for them. So it just ends up being in this rather uncomfortable middle ground where it's not going to fully satisfy either group. It's definitely not going to fully satisfy old school first-person shooter fans, and it's definitely not going to fully satisfy indie game fans, but it does have elements that will be appealing to both, and that just makes it rather confusing when you look at it. But all that said, the game is still solid enough to be playable, and it does still have its moments here and there, so I'm ultimately giving it a 3 out of 5, especially considering that the asking price for it is very reasonable. So you may want to wait for a sale if you're definitely on the fence about it, but if it looks like something that would very much appeal to you, then the asking price is low enough that I'd say you might as well go for it. Because it's not a bad game, but again, it's just not all that good either. Thanks for watching.